My name is Dan Benham, and I am a common man. I don't have any credentials, so to speak, in the educational realm or bar degrees or any kind of financial gurus. I don't have any licenses, but I used to be a private worker in the auto industry in Michigan. And at one point back in 1997, late 97, a gentleman came up and challenged the very nature of the banking system, which is what at the point in time I was doing at that time, was actually having authoritative signature power for roughly 40 to 45 different lending institutions to be able to enter contracts via the bank to the customers that came through the car dealership. So I had a lot of information available to me through my private work through the auto industry. And when this gentleman said that to me, it's my personal inheritance that I investigate everything, because what this gentleman was telling me just wasn't true. He told me that that banks created money out of thin air and some other things that just sounded totally absurd to me. So I started my own personal and private investigation into the claims and allegations that this gentleman had made, and lo and behold, it's brought me here nearly 7-8 years later. Based upon all the documentation here and plenty more, I've got a whole library at home of pitfalls, a whole lot of misinterpretations, actually even the United States Code, which is where they claim the law is. Yet if you really dissect the United States Code's government printing office's website, you'll find that the United States Code is only what they call prima facie evidence. And prima facie is like at first glance. For example, for the layman, you're traveling down the road and you need a new car, and you see a car for sale on the side of the road. And at first glance, it looks like a very nice car. It's a nice silver Camaro, and you really like the silver Camaros, and it looks like a good purchase. Well, you stop and you look at it, and it's got nice leather seats, it's got the T-tops and chrome wheels, there's no blemishes whatsoever. So now you really have prima facie evidence that this is a really nice car. For the value that whoever the private owner is selling that, you really think that you'd want to buy that car. So you go and invoke the owner into letting you take it for a test drive, and the owner then spills his guts to you and tells you that there's no engine and transmission. So basically what you have is prima facie at first glance, it is a perfect car. However, when you dissect that topic or whatever it is that you're looking at that moment in time, you actually find out that digging down farther, that car does not even have an engine. Therefore, at first glance, in turn, turns out that in fact there really isn't a very good buy for that car. And that's actually where all this information has brought me to, which has actually brought me back to the original intent of Congress, which becomes extremely, extremely relevant, especially when somebody is invoking any kind of judicial actions back and forth. If you're entertained by going to the judiciary because of allegations or presumptions against you, or if you invoke the court because of an allegation against somebody else, you would go into the judiciary. And 9 times out of 10, what happens is people will go to the code rules, or what's known as the United States Code, speaking specifically for federal issues here. State issues are obviously going to be under state code, but again under the United States Code, if one just does a simple search at the government printing office, you're going to find a page that's called United States Code About. In other words, what is the United States Code about? And it says here, again, www.access.gov/US code/about.html, you'll find that it says United States Code is the codification by subject matter of the general and permanent laws of the United States based on what is printed in the statutes at large. Well, that right there should invoke somebody's mind to go back to the statutes at large, because the United States Code is actually a codification of what was written in the statutes at large. The statutes at large are the original absolute written intent of Congress. In other words, every punctuation, every section is either deleted or added or whatnot, but the statutes at large serve as the true intent of Congress. Now, before I go any further in this, I really need to have a clear understanding on the judiciary's part. it just recently became to my attention that a new book has been published and written by a former Chief Justice sitting in the Arizona, retired, excuse me, from the Arizona bench. It's actually the judge that wrote the decision Miranda versus Arizona. And his new book is called Lawyers and Judges in Collusion. And he goes through a dissertation as to when he first got into practice back in the mid-50s, how court cases were based upon law, yet as he progressed through his judiciary, that things changed, and now it was attorneys' opinions, judges' opinions, and attorneys' theories and presumptions, and judges' presumptions and whatnot, totally in disregard for the law. And the reason that they got away with it, quite frankly, was because the two parties neglected to bring up the law. They just talked about their theories and presumptions. So it's very relevant that you understand, if you don't bring up the law, you can't appeal to that law later. However, the judiciary, it brings me to the judiciary as to why and how this chief judge would even make such claims. Why would he say that lawyers and judges are in collusion and then publish a book about it, being one of the most famous judges for writing Arizona versus Miranda? And it became apparent to me when I invoked a little bit of a law called the separation of powers doctrine, which needs to be understood so that people can have a clear understanding of what role it is that the legislators or Congress have and what role the judiciary has, and that both of them have separate roles. Unique in their own nature, but they do have two separate ones, and they can't interact with each other. In other words, the legislature can't judge cases and the judiciary can't write law, which a lot of people have no objections when a judge makes an opinion, for an example. I'm not saying that they did in any certain case, I'm just making a point here. If a judge makes an opinion that is totally adverse to what the law says, it's fine unless a party objects to it. So it's equally as important that you stop that from happening. But the judiciary's primary role, according to the separation of powers doctrine, is to interpret the intent of Congress. In other words, Congress can write a statute. For example, 13 Stat 99 includes the Banking Act of this country. Again, that's 13 Stat 99. And that's where you're going to get the bulk of the rules and regulations inside of Title 12 of the United States Code, which is the codification of the intent of Congress via 13 Stat 99 for banks and banking. Now, the legislature can write all these statutes down. Okay, that's a known fact because they're acts of Congress and they're published in the Federal Registry. However, once that's written and published, if an issue regarding that specific topic gets into a courtroom, then a judge has a fiduciary duty to interpret that intent of Congress, nothing more, nothing less. In other words, a judge has no authority to say what he thinks the law should have been or what he believes it should be. The only power that judge has is to state what the intent of the Congress was. That's all he can do. And it's very important that people understand that very concept, because if a judge starts to claim that he's going to make his own laws in his own court, well, then obviously that rings a bell for a voided contract or a voided judgment, or just plain and simple lack of jurisdiction, because he didn't have any jurisdiction that was properly delegated by his fiduciary duty to interpret the intent of Congress. Now, equally important is the legislature writes a law, and that law gets put out there. However, it hasn't been confirmed yet, and this is, to me, what the beauty of our founders did when setting up the separation of powers and the different agencies within the government, is the Congress can put their intent on paper and post it in the Federal Registry, but it's not until the judiciary confirms that intent as either constitutional or unconstitutional that it becomes effective to most of the general public. The Congress writes 13 Stat 99. if someone were to go into court and present a issue or a topic regarding that intent of Congress, then it's the justices or the judiciary's duty to look at that intent of Congress and make sure that it is in line with what the Constitution, which is their duty and obligation, they have a duty to that Constitution, is to make sure that it's constitutionally sound or not. And when they get done making that decision actually confirms the statute. So that's where the United States Code comes from. However, there's certain problems with it. The biggest problem is the bulk of the statutes at large are not available easily to the general public. You can find certain statutes online, but for the rest you have to go down to the law library. Then you have to know what you're looking for, why you're looking for it, and they've made it a compiled mess, honestly. It takes a long time for somebody, a layman, to go into a law library and say, I want to find out where Title 12 came from. It would take you the better part of a day, not knowing what you're doing, to go into the law library and find out what the intent of Congress is. But getting back to the code here, what the code is, if you go to gpoaccess.gov/US code, you're going to see all 50 titles of the United States Code. And the United States Code is branched off, again, into 50 different sections, Title 12 being banks and banking. Now, but before we get into any of the statutes, I'd like to cover what the United States Government Printing Office talks about when they say, what is the United States Code? It goes on this same website further by saying the United States Code on the Government Printing Office Access is the official version of the code. However, two unofficial editions are available. These are the USCA, which is the United States Code Annotated, and the USCS, which is the United States Code Service. The USCA and the USCS contain everything that is printed in the official U.S. Code, but also include annotations to case law relevant to the particular statute. Two things come to my mind when I read that. Number one is that the United States Code Annotated is a slightly modified or different, or for some reason they had to print two separate books, one being the annotated version and one not being the annotated version. And particular interest would draw up on the United States Code Annotated because it talks about the annotated versions having annotations to case law relevant not to the code, but again to that statute. So it says, again, relevant to the statute. However, for the layman, you can't go online and get the United States Code Annotated. Once again, you have to visit your local law library, know what you're doing, know what you're looking for, and then go find out what the true intent of the Congress was, and then get the case law relevant to the statute, which, by my understanding, is known as a case holding. Not just a court case, it's just a simple court case holding. There's tons of information in court cases. You go to Fine Law or Cornell Law, you can find court cases all the time. However, what I've found is that the ones inside the annotated version, you're not really going to see them online, number one. But number two, those court cases happen to be the confirming statute. Confirmation of statute, as I was saying earlier, the legislature writes a law, but the judiciary has to confirm it as being constitutional or not. And it's only in this annotated version that you're going to find those case holdings, which is again where the layman has a very, very limited access to it unless they understand how the law library works and so on. Now, one thing that really strikes me as offensive when I was going through doing this research is it says right here, note, of the 50 titles, only 23 have been enacted into positive law. These titles are 1, 3, 4, 5, 9, 10, 11, 13, 14, 17, 18, 23, 28, 31, 32, 35, 36, 37, 8, 9, jumps to 44 and 46. What bothers me right there is Title 12 is banks and banking, and it's not on there. In other words, what the Government Printing Office is saying is that Title 12 of the United States Code has not been enacted in a positive law. Well, what is positive law? Positive law, according to the uscode.house.gov, codification of a positive law. This is the website for the United States House of Representatives, but I went into their official Office of the Law Revision Council. What is positive law codification? It says positive law codification is the process of preparing and enacting one title at a time, a revision and restatement of the general and permanent laws of the United States. Well, now we've got a general law and a permanent law. Why would they say the two? I mean, I thought law was law. What is a general law? What is a permanent law? Why would they even have to say there's two separate kinds of laws now? One's general for the general public and one's permanent for permanent what? It drives me crazy when they say two different things like that, and you have to go and dissect more information. But here, it further goes on to say, because many of the general and permanent laws that are required to be incorporated into the United States Code are inconsistent, redundant, and obsolete, the Office of the Law Revision Council of the House of Representatives has been engaged in a continuing comprehensive project authorized by law to revise and codify for enactment into positive law each title of the code. In other words, to make that real easy for the layman, is the Congress writes a statute and then they hand it off to the Law Revision Council. Is that what they call themselves? Law Revision Council, to reword it and interpretate it and then put it up on the website under the United States Code, and that's held to be what the court is to make an interpretation on. However, right at the very last section here, it strikes me interesting where it says, positive law codification bills prepared by the Office of the Law Revision Council do not change the meaning or legal effect of a statute being revised and restated. In other words, what I just read to you can be simply stated, go to the statute, because that's where the real law is anyways. And I have a great piece here that I did a lot of research trying to find out exactly what is the difference, or has the judiciary actually talked about this topic, a statute versus a code. And I really hope that you guys will understand why I'm trying to go through this first, to get an understanding of the judiciary. Right here it says that the United States Code is not positive law, and that should read some of it's not, because some of it is, some of it's not. It's only prima facie. Again, this goes through 1 U.S.C. Chapter 3, Section 204, which it talks about the United States Code. In other words, what is the United States Code? It says here that the matter set forth in an edition of the Code of Laws of the United States, current at any time, together with the current supplement, if any, establish prima facie laws of the United States. There's that word prima facie again, at first glance. Again, it's a silver car, but we haven't seen the engine and transmission yet. General and permanent in their nature and force in the day of commencement of the session, provided, however, that whenever titles of such code shall have been enacted into positive law, the text thereof shall be legal evidence of the laws. Well, now we have a difference between legal evidence and prima facie evidence. What's the difference between legal evidence and prima facie evidence? That would be the next thing that I would talk about. I would investigate. Positive law. Law actually and specifically enacted or adopted by proper authority for the government of an organized jural society. Prima facie is at first sight, on the first appearance, on the face of it, so far as can be judged, presumably. A fact presumed to be true unless disproved by some other evidence to the contrary. Both those definitions come from Black's Law Dictionary. Black's Law Dictionary becomes extremely relevant because this is a legal topic. It could wind up in court. If you bring an encyclopedia or Webster's dictionary into court, you're using the wrong dictionary, because the judicial system uses what's known as Black's Law Dictionary. And there is a very large difference in a lot of the words. One of the words, for a little bit of humor, if anyone can grab a Black's Law Dictionary and go to the word rectum, R-E-C-T-U-M. Most people know what a rectum is, because most of you feel and believe that you actually sit on one every day. But in Black's Law Dictionary, it actually means an accusation or a trial. That's kind of very different. So if you hear that word in court, it doesn't mean what you're sitting on. It means an accusation. So you really have to watch the words. Now, I wanted to make very clear and positive sure that what I was just reading isn't just a figment of my imagination. So I went to some court cases and found several court cases about what is the United States Code versus the statutes at large. And the reason that I really want to drive this point home is twofold. Number one, I've spoken with many different lawyers, a couple of judges, and hundreds of bankers, literally hundreds of bankers, and every one of them keep going back to this United States Code. Well, the code says this, the code says this, the code says that. And I've actually confronted several attorneys and I've asked them, what about Title 62 of the revised statutes, which is 13 Stat 99, banks and banking. And one of them actually looked at me and said, there's only 50. Where do you get 62? There is no Title 62. Well, he's right and wrong. He's right because there is only 50 titles in the United States Code, but there are several hundred titles in the statutes at large. So it depends on which one you're talking about. So let's find out for sure what the courts have already decided about the statutes. Official source for the United States laws is the statutes at large, and the United States Code is only prima facie evidence of such laws. That's Royers Inc. versus United States, and that was a case holding in 1959. Well, that's pretty clear and convincing. Here's the second case. It says statutes at large are legal evidence of laws contained therein and are accepted as proof of those laws in any court of the United States. Any court can use them. Interesting. Well, I didn't want to stop there because there's millions of court cases out there. I wanted to see exactly which court cases have relevance and which ones don't. I want to make sure that every district, every state has the same rules. It further goes on to say, unless Congress affirmatively enacts title of United States Code into law, the title is only prima facie evidence of the law. Preston versus Heckler, that's a 1984 case. 1987 was prior to. So these are not court cases that go back into the 1800s. These are very relevant, very current case laws. And that one's in Alaska. Here, where title has not been enacted into positive law, title is only prima facie or rebuttable evidence of the law, and if construction is necessary, recourse may be had to the original statutes themselves. That's United States versus Zuger, again, 1984 court case. And keep that up at the top so you can write down that one. Even codification in a positive law will not give code precedence where there is a conflict between the codification and the statutes at large. In other words, that confirms what we just read here was on the Law Revision Council talking about the code. It says positive law codification bills prepared by the office do not change the meaning or legal effect of the statute, which actually is what this court here, Warner versus Golta 34, Stephan versus United States 43, United States versus Weldon 64, again Stephan versus US 43, the Motor Vessel Bearing Explorer 1974. They're all saying the same thing. Although United States Code establishes prima facie what laws of the United States are, to the extent that provisions of the United States Code are inconsistent with the statutes at large will prevail. I hope I'm building a little bit of an understanding that the statute is where we need to be. If a code, no matter what it says, it must be examined with and next to, lay down the statute and lay down the code. If they both say the same thing, then that's exactly what the intent of Congress is. However, if there is a difference in the code and the statute, what I would do based on what I'm reading is I would throw the code away and look just at the statute, because that's actually what these guys are all saying. Where there's a conflict between codification, which is the codifiers, here, United States Code again, the codifiers, where there's a conflict between codification and statutes at large must prevail. Here's another court case. This is out of 61, and it was another one in 75. Okay? Now, I want to go down a little bit further because I've seen so many of these that I just started searching by districts. The United States Supreme Court, here's a list of all court cases relevant to the same topic, just in the Supreme Court. Here's all the court cases in the Second Circuit. Here's Third Circuit. There's Fourth Circuit, Fifth Circuit, Sixth Circuit, Seventh Circuit, Eighth Circuit, Ninth Circuit, District of Columbia. So they're everywhere. In other words, what I'm trying to show you is that every district in the entire nation is saying the same thing. The statutes have to prevail over the code when there's a conflict. So again, the reason that I wanted to drive that one specifically home is because when I read the statute regarding banks and banking, it differs greatly, and I mean greatly, from what the code says. My next little adventure took me into, okay, now I understand the legislature and I understand the judiciary, but now I have to understand the banks. Where is the bank really coming from, and where do they get their rights from? Where does that absolute right and authority come from? So I started out by getting some what are known as Federal Reserve Bank publications. The Chicago Federal Reserve Bank has one that I found some interesting information on. It's called Points of Interest, and it's at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. It's a publication. Anyone can have access to it. And it says here on page 6, paragraph 7 through 10, banks and deposit creation. Because I really had a hard time understanding where did these banks get their authority. It couldn't have been from the code. It has to be from the statute. And I want to get to the statute in a little bit, but I want to explain where the banks stand on this from their own publications, and then go to the code. And I think hopefully that'll unwind what I found so far to be what I'm going to call the greatest gross misrepresentation this nation has ever seen, based upon their documents, not my theory, based upon what I've done in my own private investigation. So banks and deposit creation. Depository institutions, which for simplicity we will call banks. When I read things like that, that means to tell me that depository institutions are more than banks, because they just insinuated that it may be something different than a bank. But that's a different topic for now. Which simplicity we will call banks, are different from other financial institutions because they offer checking accounts and make loans by lending checkbook deposits. I thought they were lending money. I mean, that's what they even had me telling people. They had me believing when I was, in private contract law, doing these alleged loans to people. They were inducing the client into believing that the client was actually getting the bank's assets, and that's what caused the dual promises from client to bank for the client to pay back the bank. This brings me to loaning checkbook deposits. What in the world is that? The deposit creation activity, essentially creating money, affects interest rates because the deposits are part of the savings, the source of the supply of credits. Banks create deposits by making loans. Rather than handing cash to borrowers, banks simply increase balances in borrowers' checking accounts. Borrowers can then draw checks to pay for goods and services. This creation of checking accounts through loans is just as much a deposit as one might make by pushing a $10 bill through the teller's window. With all the nation's banks able to increase the supply of credit in this fashion, credit could conceivably expand without limit. When banks create checkbook deposits, they create money as well as credit, since these deposits are part of the money supply. Another publication out of the Federal Reserve Bank is called The Two Faces of Debt. This one is page 19, paragraphs 3 through 5. It says, for an individual institution, they arise typically when a depositor brings in currency or checks drawn on other institutions. The depositor's balance rises, but the currency he or she holds or the deposits someone else holds are reduced as a corresponding amount. The public's total money supply is not changed. That draws a lot of confusion. When you think that you go down and put, say, $100 in your checking account, you would assume that the deposits in the checking of the bank, would rise. But here it says it doesn't. But a depositor's balance also rises when the depository institution extends credit, either by granting a loan to or buying securities from the depositor. I didn't realize that a bank was buying securities from depositors. I mean, I know they buy them from investors, but I didn't realize that they were buying securities from a customer. I didn't know that any of the people that were depositors actually had licenses to engage in securities to begin with. So that's, again, obviously an oral contract that people don't know of. In exchange for the note or security, the lending or investing institution credits the depositor's account or gives a check that can be deposited at yet another institution. In this case, no one else loses a deposit. The total of currency in checkable deposits, the money supply, is increased. New money has been brought into existence by expansion of depository institution credit. Such newly created funds are in addition to funds that all financial institutions provide in their operations as intermediaries between savers and users of savings. It defined the bank as an intermediary. An intermediary is a third party, like a broker or a dealer. Okay? But individual depository institutions cannot expand credit and create deposits without limit. Furthermore, most of the deposits they create are soon transferred to other institutions. A deposit created through lending is a debt that has to be paid on demand of the depositor, just the same as the debt arising from a customer's deposit of checks or currency in a bank. Now, we heard a whole lot of words in there about debits, credits, and assets, and so on and so forth. So we really have a misunderstanding. Common knowledge would think, hey, I put my money in there, I've got an asset. But they're calling these things credits and debits. So another one that you could get is again from the Chicago Federal Reserve, which is actually called Public Debt and Private Asset. And page number, I don't see it actually referenced by page numbers. But anyways, up here in the top left corner, the page is Debt as an Asset. And this is where a lot of people get confused. It says, we all know what debt is when it is our own. We owe money to someone else. On the other hand, it may not be so easy to understand that many of our financial assets are someone else's debts. For example, to a consumer, a savings account at a bank is an asset. You put $100 in a bank account, it's your asset. However, to the bank, it is a debt. So it actually serves two things at the same time. So when they say you have a debt, well, there's a flip side to that. It's also considered someone's asset. And that's where a lot of the misconception comes from. The bank owes us the money. So it further goes down here. It says, in terms of the national debt, every dollar of the government's debt is someone else's asset. So that would tend to make me believe that this $7 trillion debt is the government's debt, but it's someone else's asset. I'd kind of like to know whose asset that is. Whose assets are those? Or in this topic, if there's a so-called loan, they're saying that there's a debt there. Well, whose asset is it? And the reason that I bring that up is several more of these court cases regarding what the banks can and can't do and where their fiduciary powers come from. I'm gonna speak about one court case first because I think it's extremely relevant that people have a clear understanding of who the bank really is, and that's one of the big questions that I need to get answered myself. Is who is the bank? Because with that question of who is the bank is where everything lies. I mean, who is going to explain who has standing? Who is going to explain who can grant the court jurisdiction? Because jurisdiction can't just be there automatically. The two parties in the action actually give the court jurisdiction based upon the subject matter. That's why they call it subject matter jurisdiction or in personam jurisdiction. So this first court case, when I had found this, I was absolutely shocked at what I read. And it very clearly says, national banking corporations are agencies or instruments of the general government designed to aid in the administration of an important branch of the public service and are appropriate constitutional means to that end. Well, what that means is that the banks are actually an agency or an extension, an arm of the United States government. Which, if now you take that thought of what that judge said, back here, it was Tarrant versus Bessemer National Bank. if you take that thought, you're actually, anyone that goes to a bank, you're really not getting a loan from the bank as a private industry. You're getting that loan from an extension of the United States government. You're actually going to the government and asking them for money. So, but I wanted to go to the nature of why a judge would say that. And is it true? I just can't possibly fathom that a bank is actually an agency or an agent, and there is a difference there, to the general government. I mean, I can be an agent for anyone I want to as long as there's a contract there. But for me to be an agency, I would actually have to be inside their corporate charter somewhere. Okay? So the very existence of them saying that they're an agency or instrument to the general government proves two different things. First of all, it proves that the government has an agency in which they deal banking with, number one. And number two, it actually says that the banking got its rights from the government. If it's an agent from the government, its duties and responsibilities have to be by that United States law, because that's where they're saying that they got the power from. Now, that drew me to a lot of investigation into that can't be true. I can't believe that a bank is an agent to the government. So I knew a little bit about FOIA laws, which is the Freedom of Information Act, which allows people to go and get general public information from whatever governmental agency is holding that document that you're looking for. And what I did is I asked for the Treasury delegation order for a certain institution. In this case, it was Fifth Third Bank, formerly Old Kent Bank. I asked them for any documents from the Treasury that would show that Fifth Third is an agent of the United States government. And they sent back this right here. And this is from the Federal Reserve Bank, St. Louis, between financial institution and Department of the Treasury regarding the Treasury's general accounting system, Fifth Third Bank. I'm just going to read from 1 and 2 here. It says, pursuant to Section 265 of Title 12 United States Code and other authorities, such as 12 U.S.C. 90, 266, and I'll try to, where's my little gizmo here so you can see all of this, and 12 U.S.C. (1464K), the Secretary of the Treasury has the authority to designate financial institutions to be depositories and financial agents of the United States. And 2, it says, by signing this memorandum, the depository, which is Fifth Third, warrants or promises that it meets the requirements stated in 31 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 202, to be designated as a depository financial agent of the government. Well, that tells me that the Treasury has the authority and that the bank can't accept that as long as it's signed.